It was just another quiet afternoon, the kind where nothing out of the ordinary was supposed to happen. I was home alone, enjoying a rare moment of peace, when suddenly the front door swung open without a single knock or warning. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. Standing there in my living room was my neighbor's son, Jason. He's around 10 years old, a friendly enough kid, but he had never just walked into my house before. My mind raced. Did something happen? Was he in trouble? I expected him to say something, anything, but he just stood there, eyes wide, as if he had seen a ghost. Jason? I finally managed to ask, my voice a mix of concern and confusion. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced over his shoulder, like he was making sure no one had followed him. That's when I noticed something strange. His hands were shaking. Whatever had brought him here, it wasn't something small. At that moment, a million possibilities ran through my head. Maybe he was hurt. Maybe something had happened next door. Maybe he had just made a mistake and walked into the wrong house. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Then finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Can I stay here for a little while? Now, I don't know about you, but when a child shows up at your house unannounced, looking terrified and asking to stay, you don't just turn them away. My instinct told me to let him in, to figure out what was going on before jumping to conclusions. I gestured for him to sit down on the couch, trying to keep my voice calm. Of course, Jason, but what's wrong? His eyes darted around the room, as if he was afraid someone might overhear. That's when I noticed something else. His clothes were slightly dirty, like he had run through the yard, or maybe even fallen. My stomach tightened. Something had definitely happened. For a few moments, he just sat there, gripping the edge of the couch with small, trembling fingers. I didn't want to push him, but I knew I had to ask. Jason, does your mom know you're here? His head snapped up, and the look in his eyes sent chills down my spine. Please, he said, almost pleading, just don't tell her yet. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just some small misunderstanding. Jason had come here for a reason, and whatever it was serious. I took a deep breath, trying to decide what to do next. But before I could say another word, there was a loud knock at the door, and that's when everything changed. The knock at the door sent a jolt through both of us. Jason's eyes widened, and he shrank back into the couch like he wanted to disappear. My heart was pounding now, too, but I forced myself to stay calm. Is that your mom? I asked, keeping my voice low. He didn't answer, but the way he clenched his fists told me everything. Whoever was on the other side of that door, he wasn't ready to face them. I hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked toward the door. The knock came again, louder this time. I took a deep breath and cracked it open, just enough to see who it was. Something about the way she said it didn't sit right with me. Jason hadn't looked like a kid who had wandered off. He looked like a kid who had run. I hesitated, not sure what to say. I wasn't trying to overstep, but something told me that just handing him back over without understanding what was going on would be a mistake. Is everything okay? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Sarah's expression didn't change, but there was a slight tension in her posture. Oh, of course. He just needs to come home now. I looked back at Jason again. He still wasn't saying a word. He was just staring at me, like he was hoping I'd understand something he couldn't say out loud. And then, in the smallest voice, barely even a whisper, he finally spoke. I don't want to go. Sarah's smile didn't falter, but I saw the way her fingers twitched slightly at her side. And in that moment, I realized I had a choice to make. Standing there was his mother, Sarah. She looked normal, her usual composed self, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. Her smile was tight, like she was trying to hide frustration. "Hey," she said, peering past me into the house. "Is Jason here?" I glanced back at him. He was sitting stiffly on the couch, staring at his hands, not moving a muscle. I turned back to Sarah. "Yeah, he's here. He just showed up a few minutes ago." She let out a small, nervous laugh. "Oh, that boy. He has such a habit of wandering off. I was just coming to get him." The room felt colder suddenly, even though nothing had changed. Jason's words hung in the air, and for a second no one moved. His mother's expression remained controlled, but there was something unsettling in her eyes, something that made my stomach twist. I glanced at Jason again. He wasn't just refusing to go home. He was afraid to. His small hands were gripping the couch so tightly his knuckles had turned white. I could feel the unspoken plea in his stare. Sarah let out a soft chuckle, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, come on now, Jason. You know better than this." Her voice was sweet, too sweet, like she was trying too hard to sound patient. "You can't just run off and make people worry." Jason didn't say a word. He just shook his head. I felt my own pulse quicken. This wasn't normal. A kid might refuse to go home because they were mad about bedtime or chores. But this was different. This was deeper. Sarah took a small step forward. "Thank you for keeping an eye on him," she said, her smile still fixed in place. "But it's time for him to come home now." My gut told me not to just hand him over, but what was I supposed to do? If I refused, it would be crossing a line. But if I let him go, would I be sending him back into something bad? Jason finally looked up at me again, and this time I could see it clearly. His eyes were wet, barely holding back tears. And then he whispered just 3 words. "She's lying to you." A chill ran down my spine. Everything in me froze when Jason said those words. Sarah's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened just slightly. It was quick, barely noticeable, but I saw it. A flash of something sharp, something unsettling. "Jason," she said, her voice still gentle, but there was an edge to it now. "That's enough. We're going home." But Jason didn't move. He didn't even look at her. His eyes were locked on me, silently begging me to understand. I could feel my heart pounding, my mind racing. This wasn't just a kid being stubborn. He was scared. I swallowed hard, trying to think. I barely knew Sarah beyond the occasional small talk in the neighborhood. She always seemed nice, friendly even, but people could hide things. And right now, Jason was making it clear that something wasn't right. Sarah let out a breath, her patience wearing thin. "I don't know what he's told you, but kids make things up all the time," she said, tilting her head slightly. "He just doesn't want to get in trouble for sneaking out." Jason flinched. That tiny reaction made my stomach twist even tighter. I knew I had to say something, but before I could, Sarah took another step forward. "Enough of this," she said, firmer this time. "Let's go, Jason." Then, without warning, Jason scrambled off the couch and bolted behind me, gripping the back of my shirt. "Please," he choked out, "don't let her take me." My breath caught. Sarah's smile was gone now. Her whole expression had shifted into something unreadable. "You're overstepping," she said, her voice low. "He's my son." I didn't move. I could feel Jason shaking behind me, his tiny fingers clutching onto my shirt like a lifeline. And then my phone buzzed. I glanced down at it, my hands trembling as I picked it up. One new message from an unknown number. I opened it and my blood ran cold. "Do not let him leave with her." My hands tightened around the phone as I reread the message, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Do not let him leave with her." I didn't recognize the number. There was no name, no explanation, just those 7 words. Jason was still clinging to my shirt. his small body trembling behind me. I could feel his fear, and now I wasn't sure if mine was starting to match his. Sarah took another step forward, her eyes flicking to the phone in my hand. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice unnervingly smooth. I hesitated. If I told her about the message, I'd be revealing that someone else was involved, someone who clearly knew something I didn't. I glanced back at Jason, my instincts screaming at me that this was more than just a mother retrieving her son. The air in the room felt heavier. Something was very, very wrong. Then my phone buzzed again. Another message. Same number. "Call the police." Now a cold sweat broke out on my skin. My pulse was racing. Was this real? Who was texting me? And if I did call, what exactly would I be reporting? Sarah must have seen something change in my face because her posture shifted. Her smile was gone completely now. In its place was something harder, something almost threatening. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be," she said, her voice sharper. "Give me my son." Jason's grip on me tightened. I could feel his breath coming fast, panicked. I glanced at the phone again. My fingers hovered over the call button. And then, before I could react, Sarah moved, fast. Her hand shot out, grabbing Jason's arm, yanking him forward with a strength that didn't match her usual composed demeanor. Jason let out a yelp, his other hand desperately clawing at my sleeve. "Stop!" I gasped, reaching for him, and then, out of nowhere, bang! A loud crash from outside, a car door slamming. Someone was here, and judging by the way Sarah suddenly froze, whoever it was, she wasn't expecting them. The sound of the car door slamming sent a jolt through the room. Sarah's grip on Jason loosened for just a second, and in that moment, he tore free and scrambled behind me again, breathing hard. Footsteps, fast, urgent, then another knock, hard. Sarah's face changed. The confidence, the control, it all cracked. For the first time, she looked nervous. I swallowed, my hands shaking as I moved toward the door. I didn't know who I was expecting to see, but when I opened it, my breath caught. A man stood there, mid-40s, disheveled, eyes wild with panic. He looked exhausted like he'd been running, and the moment he saw Jason, his face crumpled. "Jason!" His voice broke. Jason gasped. "Dad?" I felt the air shift as Sarah took a slow step back. My mind reeled. "Dad?" But Sarah had always said Jason's father wasn't in the picture, that he had left years ago, that he didn't want anything to do with his son. Jason bolted past me before I could react, throwing himself into the man's arms. Sarah let out a sharp breath. "You weren't supposed to be here." The man held Jason tight, his voice shaking. "I wasn't supposed to be here because you told me he was gone." He looked at me then, his eyes filled with something between desperation and gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered. Sarah took another step back, her face pale. And then, without another word, she turned and bolted out the back door. Jason clung to his father, his small body shaking. And as I stood there, watching it all unfold, I realized I had almost let him go with the wrong parent. For a moment, everything was still. The only sound was Jason's shaky breathing as he clung to his father. My own heart was pounding, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. Sarah was gone. She had run. I turned back to Jason's dad, who was holding his son like he would never let go again. His eyes were filled with relief, but also something else, deep sorrow. "I thought I lost you," he murmured, his voice cracking. Jason pulled back just enough to look up at him. "She told me you didn't want me," he said softly. "She said you left." His father swallowed hard, shaking his head. "No, buddy, I never left. She took you." A lump formed in my throat. It all made sense now. The fear in Jason's eyes, the way he had refused to go with Sarah. He hadn't just been running away from home. He had been running back to the person who was supposed to have him all along. Before I could say anything, sirens wailed in the distance. Someone must have called the police, maybe the same unknown number that had warned me. Jason's father exhaled, his grip tightening around his son. I need to explain everything to them, he said, looking at me. But thank you. You believed him when no one else would. I nodded, still overwhelmed. I just knew something wasn't right. Minutes later, flashing lights filled the street. Officers stepped out, and Jason's father took a deep breath. Jason held his hand, not letting go. As they spoke with the police, I stood there, watching Jason, safe, finally where he belonged. And I knew, without a doubt, that opening my door to him that day had changed everything.